Welcome to the ESA Junior Faculty Webinar Series, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. As always, we'll have our 20-minute presentations and we'll have 5 minutes for discussions. And if we have time, we will have some questions at the end. Normally, we use the after party to ask more questions to the speakers because we most of the time run out of time. So please hang around and join us during the after party. Our first speaker today is Ailin Leng. Ailin got her PhD from the University of Queensland in 2018, and currently she's an assistant professor at Nanjing Audit University. Her research mainly focuses on continuous time and cooperative game experiments. Today she'll be presenting us her study and experimental implementation of cooperative games. Ailin, whenever you're ready, you can start sharing your screen.
Hello, everyone. The major contribution of my study is to provide a novel experimental methodology that can be used to implement general cooperative games with transferable utility. So most of the experiments we have seen so far are based on non-cooperative games. Non-cooperative games clearly define individual players' strategies. However, cooperative games are structured differently. A game is defined only by two elements. The first is the set of the players, and the second is the total payoff for each feasible group formed among those players. There's no specification regarding individual players' strategies. The essence of the game is that players' action is not restricted when they are forming coalitions. Let's look at a classic buyer-seller cooperative game. For example, the set of the players are buyers and sellers. Let's call the two buyers Bob and Bessie, the three sellers Sam, Sally, and Sharon. If each player stands on their own, they get nothing. But if one buyer and one seller comes together to form a coalition, there's $100 generated that can be divided among them. For example, if Bob and Sam comes together, they have $100 generated. If Bob, Bessie, and Sam, the three of them comes together, the value content for the three of them is still 100 because now there is one extra buyer in the group. And for four players, Bob, Bessie, Sam, and Sally, now the coalitional value becomes 200 because now there are two buyer-seller pairs contained in the group. And for the five players, the total value is still 200 because again, there is one extra seller sharing in the group. So the coalitional value is equal to the number of buyer-seller pairs contained in the group. Now the question is, how would the five players divide the total $200? Non-cooperative approaches will clearly define the bargaining process. For example, the five players may take alternating turns to propose offers. Non-cooperative approaches focus on what individual players can do. They would define the negotiation process or the order of moves and individual players' strategies. The solution concept is a strategy profile such as Nash equilibrium or sub-imperfect equilibrium. However, for cooperative games, the structure of the game would stop here. The set of players and the coalitional value for each feasible group formed among those players. There's no specification of the negotiation process. The game focuses on what the group can collectively achieve. That is $100 added for each buyer-seller pairs included in the group. And the solution concept is a payoff distribution. There is no strategies involved. Based on different notions of the reasonable payoff distribution, there are different solution concepts. Like the coarse payoff distribution gives the 2 buyers everything and the 3 sellers nothing. The Shapley value gives the 2 buyers 2/3 of the payoffs, and the remaining 3 sellers share the third. So now the question is, how would you implement such a cooperative game in a laboratory setting? Although cooperative games have been studied widely in theory, the experimental studies are sparse because cooperative games does not define the order of moves and there's no specification of the action space. How would you instruct the subjects in the experiment? Usually, discrete time frames are not suitable because the subjects are limited to 1 actions per period. The protocols to bargain or form coalitions are restricted. So the solution now is to implement cooperative games in continuous time. In my continuous time experiments, there are few restrictions on the negotiation process. At any point in time, any player can make a move. Subjects propose and accept offers freely. And interaction is also dynamic in a sense that information is available instantly and responding actions can be taken at any point in time. In this way, the essence of the cooperative game is preserved. The experiment adopts the framework, the theoretical model of Perry and Rennie. They converted the cooperative game into a non-cooperative game, and their non-cooperative model adopts a continuous time frame. The experiments on cooperative games are important for the 3 main reasons. First, we need to verify theoretical predictions. We have seen this being done many times in non-cooperative games, but cooperative games are particularly important because they have different solution concepts giving contrasting predictions. For example, this is a coarse prediction and this is a Shapley values prediction. Which one is correct? We can only tell by, we cannot tell by pure theoretical speculations. And the second reason is to examine the coalition formation process. The solution concept only gives us a payoff distribution that is based on different notions of fairness. But it doesn't tell how that payoff is agreed on. For example, this is a coarse prediction. The 2 buyers guess everything and the 3 sellers guess nothing. This payoff distribution can be achieved if all of the 5 players form a ground coalition. It can also be achieved if Bob and Sam form a 2-player coalition, Bessie and Sally form another 2-player coalition, Sharon is left out completely. This is also possible if Bob, Sam, and Sally, 1 buyer and 2 sellers, form a 3-player coalition. Bessie and Sharon form a 2-player coalition. So what is the identity of the player included in the coalition? What is a coalition formation process? We need to run experiments to tell us that. The third reason is the cooperative games are more appropriate for a number of realistic situations because in real life, subjects are rarely constrained to play predefined actions or order of moves. Usually they can do whatever they want. So cooperative game experiments can help to explain a number of realistic situations. Although it's important, there are few experimental studies. I don't have time to go through them in detail, but they all use the different methods to implement cooperative games, such as free chat, double auction, voting, in discrete time, delegating, negotiation rights, and etc., etc. There is no consensus on how to best implement a cooperative game. They all focuses on the behavior of their specific game, rather than search for a methodology for general cooperative games. I'm going to explain my proposed procedure with a screenshot of my program user interface. It's divided into 3 parts. At any point in time, a player can submit a offer, accept an offer, confirm their payoff in the binding offer, and leave the game. So first, let's look at the offer submitting box. The offer has 2 elements. The first is the players included, and the second is the payoff for that included players. And the sum of the entered payoff cannot exceed the limit. The limit is the coalitional value defined by the cooperative game. So if you click the submit button, this offer is moved from this offer submitting box to the current offer box or the offer accepting box. There is only one valid offer at any point in time. The current offer is discarded if a player submits a new offer before the current offer is accepted by other players. If you are included in the current offer, this button will pop up. Then the acceptance status is displayed here. If everybody included in the current offer accept click the accept button, this current offer is removed from the current offer box or the offer accepting box to the binding offer box. And if a player has a binding offer here, he can confirm the payoff in the binding offer and leave the game. If a player clicks this button, then the player included in the same binding offer are also forced to leave. Like this is the user interface of buyer 1. If buyer 1 click this button, seller 3 is included in the same binding offer with buyer 1. Then seller 3 is also forced to leave. Then the remaining 3 players continue the negotiation process until there's no one else to bargain with. A player is committed to the offer in the following sense. First, a player automatically accepts his own submitted offer. And if a player accepts an offer or submitted an offer, he must remain quiet until the offer becomes binding or is replaced by another player's submitted offer. Also, the binding offer is committed in a sense. A binding offer can only be changed if all the included players agree on the change. So a newly submitted offer must include all or none of the players in the same binding offer. The solution concept in the above procedure is stationary subgame perfect equilibrium. It is perfect if no one can benefit from deviating. It is stationary if it does not depend on history. Perry and Rennie has proved that the payoff vector of every stationary subgame perfect equilibrium is in the core, and the core can be supported by a stationary subgame perfect equilibrium if it exists for every subcoalition. So here is the treatment design. In the baseline treatment, any buyer can trade with any seller, but in the second treatment, a trading barrier is placed on buyer 1 and seller 1. the course prediction are the same for the two treatments. That is, buyers gets everything and the sellers gets nothing. But for the Shapley value, the two buyers gets about 2/3 and the three sellers share the remaining 1/3. Also, for the two players with treating barriers, their payoffs decrease slightly, and for the other three players, their payoffs increase slightly. The experiments were conducted in the University of Queensland in Australia. An independent observation is a matching group. There are 2 groups per matching group, and there are 6 matching groups for each treatment. In total, it has 10 periods, rows randomly reassigned and groups randomly rematched after each period. The range of the earnings are quite large because some sellers get nothing except for a $5 participation fee. So here is the result for the baseline treatment. Let's look at the payoff of the two buyers first. The two buyers' payoffs starts at the 50-50 equal split. Then gradually they increase above 60 points. And for the three sellers, their payoffs fluctuated between 20 and 40 points. It looks like the payoffs are closer to the Shapley value than to the core. In fact, if you take the last 5 periods for statistical tests, you will find no significant difference between the Shapley value and the obtained payoffs. And in the second treatment, the treating barrier is imposed on buyer 1 and seller 1. It looks like the treating barrier has decreased both buyers' payoffs because before they reached above 60 points, now it stays below 60 points. At this time, the predictive power of the Shapley value seems to decrease. If you again take the last 5 periods for statistical tests, you will find a significant difference between the Shapley value and the obtained payoff, except for seller 3. So we have seen the payoffs agreed, the payoff division, but we haven't know which player has agreed on the payoffs. So this page displays the number of players included in offers. It is clear both the submitted offer and the accepted final offer, most of them are between 2 players, that is 1 buyer and 1 seller. Players still submit offers involving more than 2 players, but they are not accepted because most coalitions are between 1 buyer and 1 seller. Usually in each period, there is 1 seller left out from any coalition, and the payoff to that excluded seller is 0. Then why not include the seller and give him some positive payoff? Let's look at an example. So now Bob, Sam, Sally, the 3 of them are in a coalition. But if Bob and Sam leave Sally alone, then Bob and Sam, the 2 of them can divide the 30 points between them. Bob and Sam are collectively better off. That's why they choose to exclude the extra seller. So you may wonder the frequency of each seller being included or excluded. So does the treating barrier have any effect? So it seems the treating barrier changes the frequency of seller 1 and seller 2 being included. the training variable is placed on seller 1, then its frequency decreases by 15%. And for seller 2, it increases by 20 percentage points. So I've said that the Shapley value has a better prediction of the payoffs. That is, if the payoffs is averaged across groups and over periods. But in a single game, because one excluded seller is getting nothing, his payoff is actually the same as the course prediction. And you may also wonder how many rounds of negotiation are there? Will they just accept the first offer proposal? Then can they come up with the right amount immediately? It seems there are several rounds of bargaining before an agreement. In general, it takes about 6 offers to get one binding offer and 7 offers to get one final offer. Actually, I also have a section in my paper to analyze the negotiation process in detail, but here I don't have time to present that section. So here is my discussion section in my paper. It's about the inequality aversion, because I find one seller is excluded with nothing. Then the 2 included seller each get above 35 points. It seems the inequality aversion is only applicable to the included players. If a player is out of sight, then that player is out of their mind. Such observation is different from existing social preference models. None of them predicts that the inequality aversion should depend on inclusion or exclusion of the players. So in summary, the main contribution is a novel experimental methodology for cooperative games. It has the following 4 advantages. The first is that the essence is preserved in a continuous time frame. It is flexible and general. It's not restricted by the number of players or the coalitional value. It's backed up by theory. The core is the same as the stationary subgame perfect equilibrium. It also allows us to have a close examination of the coalition formation process. If I have time, I'll present this part in detail. And the results find that the core is correct for the excluded seller in a single game, and the Shapley value is correct for the payoffs averaged over periods, and the equality is conditional on if a player is included or excluded. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ailin. Now we'll have Dan Friedman, who's going to be discussing this paper for us. Dan, you're muted.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for including me. It's a pleasure to discuss Ailin's paper. Let me say a few general words. Cooperative games is a wonderful, important area. It used to be half of all of game theory. It's, as she says, it's defined differently, and in such a way it's not obvious how to do it in an experiment. But the essence is, as Ailin, whoops, this is Ailin. I have her presentation. Sorry, let me. Discuss. I had that all teed up, ready to go. Okay, is this big enough to see?
Yeah,
I guess I can do it bigger. There. Let me do that. Apologies, everyone. All right, so I'm happy to discuss her paper, a few overview remarks. I'll be some specific comments on this paper and then some general suggestions for later down the road. It's a great topic. Indeed, there are very few papers on it. Cooperative games have basically been eclipsed by non-cooperative games in terms of the attention of theorists, but they're still very important to economists, other social scientists, and implementing them in the lab, there's less guidance. The paper by Perry and Rennie that Ailin mentioned, I think, is a key, because it connects, sometimes called a Nash program, it connects general non-cooperative games, that is in characteristic functions, to cooperative, to non-cooperative game, and implements the core concept. So I would like to say that there's a vast potential for this sort of work, and not so many other people doing it at the moment. But cooperative games have been explored in the lab. They actually go back to the roots of experimental economics. And the first, if you look at the early days, say, before 1980, there were actually a reasonable number of papers that took that looked at cooperative games, and including some very famous ones. If you look in here, you'll see some famous names and some famous papers. But after 1980, it dwindled, and there's only been a handful since. Now, Ailin looked at a particular cooperative game, and it's a famous one, and I was the most surprising example that I heard of. So I think it's a good place to start. Sometimes it's called left shoe, or right glove, left glove. I mean, buyer seller is just another name for it. The point is that there's indivisibilities and extreme complementarities. Think of it in terms of shoes. If there's everybody has one shoe, and two of them are left shoes and three of them are right shoes, the value is in a pair of shoes, okay? And the short side, if you think about the complementarities, in this case, the short side gets all the surplus, long side gets nothing. Very striking, and for the core, and also competitive equilibrium makes that extreme prediction. Whereas Shapley value and a number of other things, including some notions of fairness and just notions of people staying away from corners, so a number of things that could ameliorate that, including Shapley value. So now looking more at the specifics, Ailin has a particular design. The setup, she should take maybe another look at the paper with Wei Bin Yan and others. There are two treatments in there called BARG and DA BARG that are actually reasonably close to what she does. So it's the point is, though, what she does is, I think, a good way to study, good general way to study these games, a nice free-form, continuous time, multilateral bargaining setup. And her focus is on core versus Shapley value. I think that's nice. But if that is the focus, there are other treatments that might sharpen the contrast between these predictions. She's got one pair of treatments, but might want to consider additional treatments that would bring out the contrast between these two. She includes a risk elicitation task. Didn't mention it, but I wouldn't expect it to explain much. I would refer to the matching groups as silos, and having 5 players rematch within a 10-player silo. I think that's a very nice way to do things. It wasn't clear to me in reading the paper how persistent the buyer-seller role assignments were, but in the presentation just now, she said, yeah, they're not persistent at all. People are reassigned roles as well as who else is among the 5-player group. And there's a soft close in there, also a nice touch, I think, in terms of when the bargaining is over. She didn't say anything about the feedback between rounds, and that could make a difference. For example, you could say what happened to both groups within the silo, what the outcomes were, and that could make a difference. Also, matching could make a difference, as I'll say. So there are other robustness things to do. If it were possible, if she has a chance to do more, I'd like to see more than 10 periods, because it's not clear to me the trend had ended. There was a trend sort of towards the core. and it was slowing down, but it's not clear to me it was over. All right, so quick remarks on data analysis. The findings are consistent with other people who've looked at this group, that the short side indeed gets a lot more, that is with a buyer, left shoe, right shoe, or gloves or so on. And everybody's looked at that has found qualitatively similar results in that the short side gets a disproportionate share, but not nearly 100%. The striking thing that I didn't know before and didn't see is that contrary to Shapley value, the treatment two, where you had asymmetries in terms of the roles, you didn't get the kind of effect that Shapley value would predict. Another nice aspect of this, which I haven't really seen before, is a detailed look at the coalition formation and the trend towards two-player coalitions, that is pairs. It was very strong, very striking, and makes a lot of sense. She has a nice analysis of dynamics. The second pair generally has a less equal split than the first pair. Under some kinds of matching, that could push you more towards core, because if the second contract affects the first contract next period, you need some role stability for that, I think. You know, that could push things more closely towards the core. I was happy to see some time lag analysis. That is, you know, like reaction time. There's a lot in the dynamic analysis that probably is a little bit too, takes too much space, and there might be ways to streamline it. But actually, I would think the paper is ready to submit now for journal submission. Referees want to say something, right? It's sometimes called referee bait. And the fact that, you know, it's a little bit clunky analysis on the dynamic analysis, you might be able to pool and so on. It's fine for a referee to ask you to do that. They wouldn't reject it just because it's a little bit long-winded. Okay, beyond that, just one more slide here. Beyond the current project, I think this basic setup will be able to look at other classic games represented in characteristic functions as characteristic functions. As long as they're not too large, I think you can use this kind of setup to investigate them. So there's a lot of potential for a lot of different sorts of games. The other thing I'd hope to see in this is variations in the bargaining protocol. For example, the way it is now, one player can immediately wipe out someone else's new proposal by proposing something else. So there are ways that, you know, proposals could stay up for longer. When I was thinking about this, I didn't know about partition functions before as well as characteristic functions, but maybe that's an even more natural way of talking about it. So bottom line is, I think there's tremendous potential for this kind of work for looking at cooperative games in the lab, cooperative games with transferable utility, and the present approach seems suited to address a lot of them. So I think it's very exciting work, and there's a lot of future potential. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Right, so we'll now, thank you to Dan, and we'll now move on here at the bottom of the hour to our next speaker is Prachi Jain. Prachi is an assistant professor in the Department of Economics at Loyola Marymount. She got her PhD from Michigan and postdoc at Princeton. And her research is, of course, behavioral and experimental, and specifically often has a development flavor, and has done a number of projects, among others, with the Busara Center in Kenya. So, Prachi, please go on ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thanks for having me. I'm excited to present work I have on imperfect monitoring and informal insurance, the role of social ties. To motivate this paper, this is really coming from kind of the recognition in development economics that poor households often use informal transfers to cope with income shocks. So when I think about informal transfers, I'm thinking about transfers between households, and these are just incredibly large in magnitude. So for example, in India, we see 63% of households have loans from informal sources. Kenya, over 40% are just either sending or receiving remittances. So these are just really large in magnitude. And so when I talk about informal insurance, I'm really thinking about this idea that, you know, when I have two households engage in transfers, there's some sort of a reciprocity in these interactions. So for example, the idea is that, well, if I have a friend and me and my friend face different income shocks, I might help him out when my friend is unlucky, because I expect reciprocity, that he will return the favor and help me out in the future if our roles are reversed. And so really, I'm going to focus in on this risk sharing, or this informal insurance channel here. And theoretically, we know that these informal insurance kind of transactions should be affected by information asymmetry. So there is a literature that looks at a variety of information or market imperfections. And I'm going to focus here on one specific market imperfection, which is imperfect monitoring of effort. And so theoretically, the story goes, right, if I think of income as both the result of luck as well as effort, if my friend knows that I'm going to help him out no matter what, right, and he can choose to shirk, he will choose to shirk, and as a result, I knowing that will be less likely to help him out and make these sort of risk-sharing transfers. And so really this paper is thinking about kind of how much does this imperfect monitoring problem matter? At the same time, we do know that in the real world, most risk-sharing or informal insurance occurs among people that know each other. And conceptually, there are reasons that we think that these social connections may mitigate or perhaps even decimate the effects of the information asymmetry. And so in this paper, I'm really going to think about kind of not just this imperfect monitoring problem, but what role these social connections play in sustaining the informal insurance when task completion cannot be observed. So when there is this imperfect monitoring problem. And I also am going to spend some time thinking about what, oops, sorry, my mistake. Screen. I'm also going to think about what are the primary mechanisms through which social connections have an effect. And so of course, social connections transmit, there's a lot of reasons they might matter. And so here I'm going to think about 4 specific channels. One is this idea of altruism, the fact that I just care about my friend and their utility directly enters my own. Or this worm glow altruism, the fact that I enjoy giving to my friend and that makes me more likely to help my friend out irrespective of the information environment. The second channel is a story about information. So again, maybe I know my partner really well, and in this world where I can't see their effort, I know that they're really hardworking, and as a result, that makes me far more likely to engage in risk sharing with them. The third channel that I'll think about is this kind of broad term of social collateral, this idea that even though my experiment is going to be a single session, for people that are socially connected, it's part of a larger repeated game, and that larger repeated game creates some sort of utility value where I might fear the loss of the friendship, or, you know, fear that I'll get socially sanctioned if my partner thinks I shirked, and that will help me behave in the experiment and cooperate. The last channel is a story of intrinsic motive. So this idea that perhaps when task completion is unobservable, I am more intrinsically motivated when I know my friend, and that makes me both more likely to work hard, but also more likely to cooperate. And so I'm going to think about kind of disentangling these different mechanisms in this paper. How I do so is I do this at the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics, which is in Kenya, and it's more of a traditional laboratory experiment. So I think using the terminology of Harrison and Liss, it's an artifactual field experiment where the participants are actually from informal settlements in Nairobi. And so that means that these are participants, and I have survey data on this is a relevant behavior. They engage in these sort of informal transfers in their day-to-day. They face low and variable income. And so this is intentionally embedded in a context that they are perhaps familiar with. And what I do in the experiment itself is I vary whether task completion can be observed, right? So I both have to be able to see my partner's effort or task completion, but also whether this task completion can be contracted on. So the idea being that I can actually penalize my partner if I can both see their task completion and promise like, oh, I won't help you out if you choose not to work hard. That's going to get me at this dimension of imperfect monitoring. The second dimension is that I'm going to randomize partners across the game. So this is a within subject experiment where participants play both games. And so I randomize partners, which means that sometimes they play with partners they know, and sometimes they play with partners they don't know. After the experiment, I use a survey and some administrative data to get at what their social connections are with their partner. And so this is giving me natural variation in whether they have a relationship with their partner or not. And the fact that I have kind of multiple observations of these individuals with different partners allows me to use individual fixed effects that can soak up kind of individual characteristics that are game invariant. Okay. So to start off with, income in the games have to be risky. So these are one-shot games with a single partner. So kind of the theme of cooperation, they have to work with a partner. Income is independently distributed and observable so that my income does not affect my partner's income and vice versa. And participants can either receive a high or low income shock. And so that results in 4 states of the world that they have to discuss or think about. One where I get high income and my partner gets low income. One where the roles are reversed. A world where we both get this low income, and one where we can both get this high income. And so when I talk about informal insurance or risk sharing transfers, what's really interesting to me here is these transfers when one individual has high income and the other individual has low income, right? And so even though these are one-shot games, the incentive to make transfers comes about because if I'm going to promise my partner, right, if I have high income and I'm promising my partner that I'll give him money if he gets low income, I expect him to return the favor and say, okay, if the roles are reversed, I'll help you out. So even in this one-shot game, that reciprocity motive is present if we think about these different states of the world. Because I'm interested in this task completion or effort component, income is risky. It's determined both by chance and completion of a real effort task. And so importantly, if I see my partner's income, I don't know whether or not they worked hard, but certainly working harder and completing this task is going to increase the likelihood that they get this high income. And so here, if you complete the task, the probability of getting a high income shock is 75%, whereas if I don't complete this task, the probability that I get a high income shock is only 25%. And so next, I'll talk about the task. Because I didn't want this to be kind of in a context where low income participants could, or possibly illiterate participants could partake in the experiment, the real effort task, I used a real effort task, and it was a counting zeros task, where as you can see on the screenshot here, participants were presented with grids of zeros and ones, and their job was to count as many of these grids as possible, and they were considered to have completed the task if they did this for at least 45 grids. So these grids never had more than 15 zeros. So in theory, I think I was trying to make a task that was achievable for everyone in my participant pool, and mostly the result of effort, though of course in the paper I think carefully about whether ability plays a role. I argue that this is mostly about effort, and so they have 5 minutes to count at least 45 grids correctly. And if they choose not to do that, there is a task of an option for leisure where they can instead watch the video. Okay. So the games follow kind of this overall structure where participants are presented with this information exactly similar to kind of what I've told you. If they haven't played the effort games yet, then they are actually allowed to practice the task and familiarize themselves with the task by doing a piece rate round where they're paid piece rate and just do the real effort task. And then they negotiate these contracts. So one important dimension of this is that these contracts are ex ante binding contracts. So basically my partner and I talk in a free-form way. So participants stand up and communicate face-to-face and have these worksheets where they write out these contracts that say, okay, for each of these scenarios, how much am I willing to share with you and vice versa. And these contracts are enforced. So they write these contracts, they enter them into the computer, and then they individually attempt the real effort task. Depending on the game, then task completion is announced to both the partner and the participant. And then finally, at the end of the session, income and transfers are determined based on these contracts. So one important feature is, again, this ex ante binding contract, which certainly I don't think is realistic, but I use it because theoretically we would expect that if these contracts are ex post after income is already known and the task is attempted, that we would open the door to limited commitment. which is theoretically a different reason for reducing risk sharing. So I really wanted to narrow in on this one channel. And so here the contracts differ across the games. In the unobservable task completion game, right, I can only see my partner's income, and so my contracts can only condition on these possible income realizations. Whereas in contract, in the observable task completion game, I can both see whether or not my partner completed the task as well as their income. And so these contracts can actually condition both on income and task completion, resulting in 16 choices. And so the idea here is, right, if I have these perfect contracts in the observable game, then I can actually write a contract where I penalize my partner, right? So for example, I can promise, well, if you behave and you complete the task and we both complete the task, I'll help you out if you happen to get unlucky. But if you don't complete the task, then I will not give you any money. And so these contracts allow for this kind of perfect kind of first best equilibrium. Then, of course, the second difference between the games is that task completion is also announced in the observable game. Since this is within subject, as in both participants play both games, I order the game order, and so that allows me as a check to make sure that this isn't just about the experimenter demand effects. The second dimension is the social ties. And so as I mentioned, what I do is I randomize partners, so participants are assigned to different partners that they interact with. And after the experiment, I use a combination of administrative data and survey data to look at what their social connections were. And so the first measure that I use is coming from administrative data from the Busara Center. And it's whether participants belong to the same village. So in this Kibera village, it's about 200,000 people, and there's about 8 villages. So it's kind of where you live within the informal settlement. But also whether you belong to the same ethnic group as your partner. So for Luo, Kikuyu. And so here, I use whether or not participants belong to the same ethnic group and same village as their partner. This is, you could think of this as like an in-group social tie, and about 52% of participants have this relationship with their partner. The next two measures are coming from survey data, where I ask them a series of questions at the end of the experiment about how they interact with their partner. And I'll be upfront, the social connections in this are somewhat weak. So when I look at how they interact with their partner, they tend to interact with them at most in one dimension. And so my first measure of kind of the direct relationship is what I call partner relationship, which is whether the participant claims to know their partner. And here, 26% of participants say that they have this relationship with their partner. The second measure that I use is a two-way relationship, which is not only do I claim to know my partner, but they also claim to know me. And so here, 14% of individuals have this relationship with their partner. And so one thing I want to point out, since I'm going to present results for all three of these, is that you should be thinking about this as the increasing different types of social connections, right? So number one is really about more in-group, not that I know this person, but that I have some sort of an affinity because we speak the same language. Whereas as we move down to this third measure, we should think that these are stronger social ties. And so personally, my favorite measure is this partner relationship two-way measure, because it's both a stronger social tie and it's less subject to measurement error than number two. But I'll show you all of the results. Okay. So the empirical specification is my main outcome of interest is whether there's any sort of risk sharing transfers. So that thinking about the extensive margin, whether I make any sort of transfer to my partner when I get high income and they get low income. I control for the game, so either the observable or unobservable game. I control for the relationships, so which of the three measures we just discussed. And then of course I have an interaction. Because it's within subject, I can use these individual fixed effects, and I cluster my standard errors at the individual level. So here you can think of alpha 2 as picking up the overall effect of the relationship, and alpha 3 picking up whether there's some sort of a different effect of this relationship, specifically in that imperfect monitoring game. So first, I'll show you kind of the results all together. So what I've kind of boxed in red is this overall effect of the relationship, alpha 2. And so what we can see here is across all three measures of social proximity, alpha 2 is not statistically significant. I should be careful because it is positive and the magnitudes are somewhat large, but certainly kind of in comparison to the other coefficients, I don't seem to find that there's a significant overall effect of these social relationships on whether or not they engage in risk sharing. The second thing I look at is alpha 3. So, right, this is picking up whether there's something about these social relationships that have a differential effect when imperfect monitoring is present. And what I find is that certainly I find that for these stronger measures of social proximity, there's something. So specifically for this partner relationship two-way measure, there's a large and statistically significant effect in that game. But what is also reassuring here is the fact that as my social connection gets stronger, the coefficients get larger. And so I think this tells me a story that, like, we would imagine that the stronger the tie, the more of an effect we should see. And that's what I see here. Thinking about the comparisons that are interesting, there's two comparisons that are really interesting. One is thinking about whether socially connected participants are better off than socially unconnected participants when there is an imperfect monitoring problem. So this is saying if we think the real world is a world where I can't see my partner's effort, then this is telling me how much better off my socially connected participants are. And so here I see that there's a huge effect across all three measures. So thinking about the strongest measure in column 4, that socially connected participants are, if anything, 47% more likely to risk share than strangers in this imperfect monitoring world. The second thing I can also think about is whether if we think the real world are full of people that are socially connected, are they better off or worse off in this imperfect monitoring world? And so, to be clear, the first two coefficients here are not statistically significant. But for this third measure, I find that actually socially connected participants are 20.8 percentage points or 30% more likely to risk share when I can't see what my partner does than when I can. And so I think this is actually kind of counterintuitive because this is saying that actually socially connected participants are risk sharing more when they can't see what their partner is doing than when they can. Okay, I'll try to be brief here. I think about the mechanisms, right? What is it really going on that these social connections are doing? And as I mentioned, if I think about the story being directed altruism or warm glow, that I just like my partner, then we would expect that to increase cooperation overall, and that should have shown up in alpha 2. And so since I don't see statistically significant evidence, I can't say this is not present at all, but certainly this doesn't seem to be the main channel for the results I see. The second thing I think about is the story of better information. And the story, remember, is a story where in the observable game, I don't care if I know my partner because the contract perfectly specifies what will happen if they don't complete the task. Whereas in the unobservable game, there's some sort of uncertainty. And if I know my partner better, perhaps it reduces the uncertainty. And if I think they're more likely to work hard, I actually will risk share with them more. And so I check this by, the survey, I have a bunch of questions about whether they believe their partner completed the task in the unobservable game and information about their partner, so just a series of life questions. And I find that kind of surprisingly, that the social connections are not at all positively correlated with these measures, probably because these are relatively weak social ties. But I mean, at least in my experiment, this can't be the main path. And so the third channel is kind of combining the other two, and I'm calling it this incentive to work. This idea that these social collateral and intrinsic motivations create some sort of an extra reason for me to work hard when imperfect monitoring is present, right? So the idea with social collateral is I'm really, if my partner thinks that I've deviated from the contract and that's why I got low income, I fear social sanctions, or I fear that they're going to cut off our relationship. And as a result, I'm going to work harder in this unobservable game. Similarly with intrinsic motivations, because those observable contracts fully specify what happens if I don't behave, you can think of those as more extrinsic motivations. But now in this unobservable game, I want to work harder because I feel more intrinsically motivated in this scenario. And so both of these should pass through, both in terms of affecting the work, whether or not the task is completed, as well as only show up in this unobservable game. And so that is exactly what I find here. I find that, and to be fair, this is only true for the strongest measure of social proximity. but I see a similar pattern where as the social relationship gets stronger, the coefficients become more positive and statistically significant. And I find that, in fact, yes, it is that these participants that are risk sharing are also far more likely to complete the task in this unobservable effort game. So here it's the same regressions as before with task completion as the outcome. To conclude, I find that there's something about these social connections that really matter when task completion can't be observed. So as a result, in some sense, the imperfect monitoring problem is irrelevant for socially connected participants. And this is despite the fact that these are somewhat weak ties. And so what's quite striking is even though there are limitations to the design, as I'm sure we'll talk about, these findings are consistent with Chandrasekhar et al., who use a similar set of experiments, but in a very different context, to study limited commitment. They also similarly find that in some sense, social connections make the market imperfection irrelevant. And then I think a little bit carefully about what is going on, and I say, look, it seems to be a combination of social collateral and intrinsic motives, so I can't fully separate out the both. Okay, I'll end there. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Prachi. Now we have to discuss Prachi's paper. We have Ben Bexell, my colleague here at UEA. Ben, over to you.
Hello. No camera.
All right, you're good, yeah.
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah, finally.
Yeah,
Sorry.
We see that. You look good there. You're just not quite at the top of your page, but otherwise we can see the share.
So you can see my face and my PDF as well?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about this. Yeah, my browser crashed 3 times already, so hopefully there won't be any further problems. So thanks for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to discuss Prachi's paper. I think this is a really nice paper, a very important one, a very important topic. We know one of the main sources of development in poor countries is risk and how people deal with risk. There are mainly 2 stories or 2 arguments. There's a positive and a negative side. And most of the literature focuses on the negative side. If you have relatives in your village, then you need to be careful, because if you're doing well in terms of income, you have to share. And then people anticipate this and don't put a lot of effort to maximize their income. So that's the negative side of the story. The positive side is that you can help each other if things go wrong. And this might stimulate risk-taking, which is needed if you want to increase your income. So I like this paper very much because it has a positive message. So the main contribution I see with this paper is the combination of 2 elements. On the one hand, there is these social connections that increase the likelihood of risk sharing when effort is unobservable, and this then in turn has a positive effect on effort in risk taking, which reduces the risk taking. And it's the combination of both which is, I think, the key contribution to the literature. I have a few comments about the design. First of all, well, in the design, the participants, they have to do an effort task to determine the level of risk, which I find a bit of a redundant layer of complexity. I think it would have been easy if we could just ask people to choose the risk level directly. So I think the reason behind it is because there was another game that was not included, where there wasn't any effort, and then probably they wanted to compare it with that other game, but that wasn't included in the paper. So so you could have just used a a lottery game, lottery choice game, without any effort. And the other element that I struggled a bit with was that there were actually two changes made between the two tasks. So on the one hand, there is the completion of the game can't be observed and can be observed, but at the same time, the choice set is also changed when they negotiate about the contract. So there are actually two changes that are made between these two treatments. So I'll get back to that later when I share a few comments about results. Then, of course, this is a within subject comparison approach, which I think, well, as we know, it tends to increase the size of the treatment effects compared to a between comparison approach. I'm a bit worried about learning effects or carryover effects. So people do one game, then they move on to the second game, but the partner is changed, which is the main focus of the analysis, but at the same time, also the game is changed. So here again, two things are changed at the same time. So that's another concern I have, which has implications for the results. Yes, here again, so the participants are actually asked to put effort to choose the risk level. So I wonder how the results might have changed if subjects were asked to directly choose the risk level instead of asked to put effort, which would then influence the risk level. The reason I'm interested in is that effort and risk-taking, that there are two separate sources of inequality, and they might lead to very different fairness views. People might look very differently at inequality depending on whether you put effort or whether you put a lot of risk in the task, whether you chose the risky option. So we know that we've got these papers of Kaplan and Tungenden published in AR that disentangled these two sources of inequality. And the order effect is related to the within subject design. So I didn't immediately find it in the paper, but I think it would be interesting to only look at the first game played because it was the order was randomized. So you could actually also do a between subject comparison to see whether, at least as a robustness test, I think that would be very useful. The other thing you could do is dyadic analysis. So the focus was really on the individual, how much they agree to share, but you have to, of course, to a pair of participants. So you could also look at the likelihood that both participants in a pair put the effort to lower risk, only one of them or none of them. And so after agreeing how much they would transfer, they in the next stage of the experiments, they then do the task, and they can choose to put a lot of effort or just watch the video. So there are actually three combinations, three outcomes here if you look at it from a dyadic perspective. So that could be a nice addition in the analysis, I think. Then a few comments about the social ties. So for this experiment, they went all the way to Kenya, which I think is great because it's really important for these societies. People share risks, but then they used participants who actually, well, most of them, they are not related. There are no kinship ties. There are no friendship ties. So the focus was really on whether they know each other, and I think an important dimension of social connections in these societies are kinship ties and friendship ties. But that would have been a nice additional layer of analysis, of course. It's of course great that some very interesting results were found, even with these weakest type of connections. They just whether you know each other or not. So that's the weakest connection you can imagine. So, but I imagine that if we used kinship ties or friendship ties, that we could have found much stronger effects. Then a few two last comments about the interpretation. So how I interpret these results is that okay, so the main result is that social connections increase transfers when the task is unobservable, and this is driven by a larger effort in the task. So the main question becomes then whether these subjects actually anticipated this when they negotiated the contracts, because the results suggest that. I'm not sure whether they elicited the participants' belief about this, which would be also a nice additional analysis to make that link between these two aspects. And then finally, Prachi, she listed 3 different mechanisms, and she provided additional analysis to test each of them. I think there is a 4th one, which is that, and it's also well, it's the social proximity. You're connected with others. This increases risk sharing, and I think it's because
We may have lost Ben. Right. Well, since it is a little bit after the top of the hour, let's hope we can get Ben back. But
okay, so we might have lost 10 as well.
We will add it to the video. Pick it up. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I did want to then close by thanking Ailin and Dan in absentia, because Dan did have to go off to another meeting, and then also Prachi and Ben at the moment in absentia for participating today. Thank you to the attendees as always, and we can now open up the after party. So thank you all. We have 1 more week, by the way, of these scheduled for next week, and then we'll take a break, but we may do something else in the autumn. So keep your eyes peeled on the various ESA information sources for that. All right. Have a good day, all.
Hi. Thanks, Ted. So there are some questions in the Q&A, and since Diego has to run in very shortly, I'm going to ask him to ask his question first. Go ahead, Diego.
Thank you, Yan. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Prachi. I thought it was a very interesting presentation. I have one question regarding the anonymity or what information participants get regarding the decision of others. And this might be especially important if they know each other outside, due to the social ties, and to what extent that the extra game decisions, the reputation that they carry after the game, knowing each other and how that may dominate payments. If I understand correctly, they know the decisions of others during the game, and they know the identity of others. So are you concerned about a little bit loss of control there, as that reputation, extra game decisions might dominate the game payments?
Yeah, so I cannot rule that out entirely. I did do it so that one game was randomly chosen for payment, and I don't reiterate their effort choice, but I just say, here's your income, and this is what was paid. But certainly it is true that I cannot rule out these concerns entirely. So I tried to minimize it with the randomization of payment depending on the game, but it's possible. Yeah. I wish I had a better answer.
Thank you.
Hello. It seems my browser crashed or something.
Yes.
I wasn't aware of that, so I just kept talking.
Maybe you could finish your comments.
Do you know where it froze?
Prachi, do you want?
If you can pull up the document, I know exactly. I can remember where.
Yeah, it's my browser is now preventing access to share my screen.
Okay.
Well, was I saying something about the results already? Because I've got literature, design, and then results.
Yes. So you'd already talked about the dyadic analysis. You'd already talked about kind of the fact that these ties are perhaps not as strong as what we would normally think of for risk sharing. I don't know if this is helpful.
Okay, then just two remaining elements.
Oh, Kirby has chimed in and said you were talking about the fourth mechanism.
Yes, so that's actually only one element so it's about not expecting opportunistic behavior. So you have these three mechanisms. Generosity or altruism, information effect, and then an incentive to work. But I think there is a fourth mechanism. These risk-sharing institutions only work if you expect the other not to behave opportunistically. And in your experiment, that means that you need to minimize your exposure to risk by putting effort in the task. So I think that's a fourth mechanism. And it makes sense because you only observe this with social connections where the effort is unobservable. So you would only come to an agreement to make transfers if you expect from each other that the other person wouldn't behave opportunistically. And this is also what we found in you refer to a paper of ours. Hello?
Yes. Yes, which was on risk-taking, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, so people, they are a bit reluctant if they are connected with people they know and with friends. So they actually don't want to take too much risk. So they know they're a bit careful. So the risk sharing is good as long as you're not perceived by the other that you're actually behaving opportunistically. And I think it's very much in line with what you found in your paper.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that comment.
Then some of the participants asked whether you can share your comments, because I think people have to leave by 11 Eastern. So and if you can, we'll post it on the website. We also have two more questions in the Q&A. One of them is by Chen Sun. Chen, do you want to ask your question? You're muted right now. So this is a question for Ailin.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you again. Hi, Ailin. I like your work very much. I'm interested in the way you implement a cooperative game. I wonder if in your design, only one current offer can be put on the table at a time. And if so, did you observe that people compete for the table?
You're muted.
There is only one valid offer on the table at any point in time, and I did find that people compete for the table, particularly the sellers. So there are basically two motivations to propose offers. The first is to bargain payoffs. The second is to compete to be included in the current offer. So I do try to separate the two motivations in the additional results section that I didn't present today. But I find that buyers mainly to bargain payoffs, they reject previous payoffs given to them more often than the sellers, and sellers mainly wish to be included.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So there's one more question in the Q&A by sender Understal. This is also for Ailin, and he cannot stay, so I'm going to read it out loud. And so he said, how do the cooperative games you study differ from the experimental markets studied by Vernon Smith and Charlie Plott? I think Dan might have answered that question in his comments, but do you want to take that up?
First of all, the buyers and sellers are just the names. These cooperative games modeling two types of players trying to form groups. So we may call the two types buyer or sellers, or left shoes, right shoes, or even gloves, or whatever you choose to call them. So basically, if the number of the two types are different, then the core gives a short side everything, then the long side nothing. So this is a classic cooperative games, and also I use buyer seller in my experiments because I think subjects can understand it better than gloves or shoes. I think compared with market games, course in market games usually you cannot choose how many buyers or sellers you want to form groups or you want to bargain with. Usually it's preset, and the relationship is one buyer and one seller for most of the market experiments. I think the payoff division might be similar in my paper and other market experiments, but the structure of the games are very different from those market games.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think that's fair. I think he might have, we'll have to ask him, but my interpretation is in some of the earlier experiments, buyers and sellers, it was not computerized. So buyers and sellers can sort of roam around the room and, you know, bargain for whether we can reach a deal or not. And if a deal breaks down, then they go on and find someone else. And so that definitely has the continuous time feature, but you're right that they could not explicitly exclude someone, right? They cannot form a coalition and say the four of us are in, you know, X is out. So I think that might have been the key differential factor. Okay, so I think we handled all the questions in the Q&A. If anybody in the audience has a question, you can use the raise hand feature and we will promote you to become a panelist so you can ask your question, or we can just unmute you. So I don't see any hand raised. Okay. So when I listened to the presentation, so this is, I have a question for Ailin. I'm just going to take advantage of the fact that I can speak. So Dan addressed this. I guess the two sellers are identical otherwise, right? Yeah. So I was wondering why you analyze them differently. So in your analysis, so Dan said the referees might ask you to pull the sellers and then pull the buyers. So I was wondering whether among the three buyers, are they different in any way? If, you know, I didn't catch that in your presentation.
The three sellers, one has trading barriers, the other two doesn't.
Okay.
So I just don't see the point of putting the other two. It won't save much space. Also it looks like players seems to make a seller one the default seller to bargain with. Of course, this is the orders that's ranked. If seller one has a trading barrier, seller two seems to become the default player. But there is some behavioral difference.
Okay, okay. So they're not symmetric. That was what I was trying to.
Here is symmetric behavior is not.
Okay, okay, yeah. All right. So any other questions from the panelists or the audience?
So Wenbo has a question whether I see a gender difference. No, I try to add gender in the regression, but it's not significant.
Okay. All right. So if there are no further questions, we thank Prachi, who got up very early, and Dan.
Thank you for the opportunity.
And also Ailin, who stayed up very late for presenting their work, and Ben, who was called upon quite recently to discuss Prachi's paper. So thanks to all the participants and to everyone who came to the seminar. We have one more next Wednesday, so I look forward to seeing everyone in a week. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.